I'm just thinking about what it is to have a body and a brain and a central nervous system. Come on, Peeps! Sorry, I got my dog with me, look, she's been very slow this morning. Anyway, I'm just thinking about bodies, brains, central nervous systems. And I'm thinking back to some stuff I was reading about a couple of years ago now, to do with neuroscience and evolution of consciousness, that kind of thing. And particularly the evolution of this thing called a self, you know. And the stuff I was reading with people like Antonio Damasio and his book When Self Comes to Mind, I think it's called, something like that. But also Thomas Metzinger, who again at that time he wrote a book called Being No One, I think it was called. Yeah, I think it was called Being No One. There was certainly a YouTube video I watched called Being No One, with Thomas Metzinger, again talking about, you know, how having a body might give rise to this thing called a self, you know, and the feeling of what it's like to be a self. Because I don't know about anybody else, but I feel, well, I do feel like I've got a self, or I am a self, something like that. But it doesn't feel like it feels like it's got structure to me, and the structure of myself feels a little bit like one of those Russian Matryoshka dolls. You know, I feel like I've got a series of layers. That's kind of how I imagine myself to be. So there's a kind of core self that I can't directly access, but I kind of feel it's there, and which doesn't have a lot of content to it. This is just my subjective experience. It doesn't have a lot of, you know, things that you would say about it, but it kind of feels like it persists over time. That it's the unchanging bit. Maybe it doesn't even really have a sense of time, or maybe it's just got a sense of time and nothing else. It's that kind of a feeling. And then outside of that core there's a number of other shells to do with I don't know, but different kinds of ways, the things that do change but more gradually, or the things that do have more variance in them. Like here I am in this woods near Truro, and you know, my body's changing in temperature slightly as I come down the hill as opposed to going up it. My levels of exhaustion are changing as I walk. I'm getting slightly different changes in the feelings of the muscles as they move, those kind of things. But they all change round about within a range, you know. And that's a level of self that I've got. I can definitely feel this body that's moving and changing temperature and doing all that kind of thing as being me, but it's not the core me, you know what I mean? And there's all those kind of social things as well, isn't there? You know, myself as I am, as a father, as a dog owner, as a person who does the job I do. There's all those kind of things which are kind of much more variable, or have changed much more over time. You know, obviously I wasn't a father 20 years ago, and now here I am, a father. So clearly that's a massive change that's taken place. But it's part of myself now. So, and again, I see that as a, you know, if I can just stay with this Russian doll kind of metaphor, that's further out. And then there's other parts of myself which are possibly even further out than that. But it's, as I say, it's a nested set of dolls. Just have to climb down this thing here. It's a bit tricky. Still there, Phoebe? The road at the bottom of it. I don't want Phoebe to get run over. So I'll get down first and make sure everything's safe. Still there, Phoebe? Oh. Okay, quick, cross the road. Quick, come. Okay. So that's the model of the self that I imagine myself having. So I'm thinking, well, how does that relate to the evolution of this thing called consciousness, and the fact that here I am, a body with a brain, and a body and a brain as a kind of single unit working together, evolved from simpler bodies with simpler brains, presumably evolved out of even simpler systems which didn't have things called brains at all, or central nervous systems at all. So how did that all happen? And is there a relationship between that process and the evolution of this thing called the self that I have now, which I've just tried to describe? Alright, over the style. The way I'm kind of imagining it is, on some levels, I'm just imagining myself as a really simple organism, even simpler than I really am now. That's pretty damn simple. A really simple organism that doesn't have any motion, doesn't move about, doesn't do anything complex, doesn't have any social engagements. It's just, I don't know, something that's sessile, you know, something that's like a bump on a log, or like a piece of mould or something like that. I don't know if that's accurate, but something really simple. And what kind of a system would that need? Well, I'm thinking what it would need at minimum is some kind of internal feedback mechanism, almost like a thermostat, a command and control system for maintaining a coherent state. I imagine even really simple organisms must have something like that. You know, even if it's just something as simple as regulating the internal chemistry of the organism. You know, because even simple organisms do change their chemistry, don't they? And affect their and modulate that all the time. So something that's has a system for monitoring its, let's call it a brain for now, even though it's not a brain. So let's say the little organism's got a brain, and all it's capable of doing is just monitoring the internal state and responding to any changes in that bodily state by doing something, you know, effecting a biochemical change, raising temperature, lowering temperature, doing things like that. So it's just like a set of thermostats or feedback loops that are just maintaining the bodily state. I mean, it can only, that kind of thing could only work if there is a kind of default setting, a standard setting somewhere programmed into the organism. You know, this is how you should keep your, this is what temperature you should stay at, this is the alkalinity you should stay at, this is the I'm running out of variables, but you know, a set of variables, and if anything wanders off this setting, enact this mechanism in order to bring it back to that setting again. Do you know what I mean? That just like a little list of the ideal state, optimal states, and that must be held somewhere in the mechanism of the organism, let's say the brain of the organism, at all times, like a checklist. And this, it just keeps checking its bodily state to see if that checklist is being adhered to, and if it doesn't, it just sends out puts in place an operation to bring it back to normal. Now it seems to me that I must have one of those too, even though I do all these other things like move about, talk to video cameras and walk my dog and things. On a very simple level, there is a chemical milieu, as Antonio Damasio calls it, an internal milieu in my body. I do have all those chemical and biochemical and temperature mechanisms going on, just like the really simplest organisms there are. And there must be part of my brain which also have that kind of checklist, a little mannequin of myself that it's comparing that state to, and saying, oh, you know, I need to just raise that a little bit, I need to do that a little bit. Not saying anything, of course. You know what I mean? It's responding to any changes in the body that deviate from that checklist of optimal conditions. Really, really simple. And that's stationary. And that checklist doesn't change. You know, that default state, that set of optimal settings, that doesn't change. That's persistent. It's been persistent from when I first drew breath, probably before I drew breath. And it's never going to change, because if it ever does, you know, if the body wanders far off that checklist, I die. So that's persistent throughout. A little bit like this contentless point that I suspect I have, or just I feel like I intuitively feel I've got in the core of my being, you know, and the core of my self-definition. This feeling of being alive and awake feels like it's got a contentless core. And the operations, the systems of my body have kind of, and my brain have kind of got a contentless core, which is this default settings, isn't it? This little mannequin, this little ideal checklist of Fred settings. And then there's other things outside of that, aren't there? You know, there's you know, however, not exactly a checklist, but my body is, and my brain is constantly in communication with one another. You know, my body's constantly checking what my brain's constantly checking what my body's doing. You know, seeing that where my limbs are within the range of operation that they have, and if my range of operation is extended, you know, if I hurt myself by stretching too far, my body is telling me that, my brain is telling me that, bringing it back into that. So there's a range of operations, more variable than the checklist of core bodily states, but still persistent enough to be me, you know. And then there's other things, isn't there? Then there's other much more socially bound up and experiential kinds of things, like the fact that I've got a kid, the fact that I've got a dog, or several children actually, only one dog, and those presumably are kind of layered on top of all that. Anyhow, does that make any sense? My arm's tired more than this camera. I haven't done it for a couple of weeks. I suppose I'm just thinking, yeah, I'm just rehearsing that idea really, that this thing called a self, this psychological condition, me, this thing I point to when I want to address myself, this thing here, it maps pretty damn close onto the body-brain relationship, doesn't it? So the body is probably the self is probably one big metaphor sourced from the operation of the body, and that feeling of being a person is probably one big metaphor sourced from being a biological organism trying to get on in the world. Anyhow, that's it. It's nice to have Phoebe back with me. There she is, being a dog. She's got one of those. She's got most of that stuff going on. She hasn't got any children, and she doesn't own a dog herself. She owns a human, but she probably doesn't know she does. Isn't that right, Phoebes? Phoebe! Phoebe! Hello!